it gives a provider a great way of getting to the root cause of a patient's issues from an inflammatory perspective. And as we all know, inflammation is the root cause of so many disease states. So I think for many providers, it gives an entryway into a patient's systems in many ways by looking at the food sensitivities, because all your patients are eating every day. Sometimes, what they're eating will have a dramatic impact on how they feel. So I think for a lot of providers, I think it gives them a nice entree into having some information on their patients, which I think the nice thing from a patient standpoint is it's non-judgmental. So, for a lot of patients, they'll go in and they'll see the doctor and they'll say, oh my gosh, your cholesterol's through the roof, bad you. Whereas I think with food sensitivities, there's no judgment attached to it. So if you're sensitive to egg, Rob, and I'm sensitive to dairy, for example, it's not, oh my gosh, here's someone else kind of bashing me over the head because I'm not as healthy as I should be, defined by whatever that might be. And so I think the great thing with food sensitivity is it gives you a non-judgmental way of opening up the patient and giving some really good insights into them based around their inflammatory responses, but also on an individualized basis. So I think you're giving them three really cool things. You're giving them what might be going on from an inflammatory standpoint, individualized information, but in a non-judgmental way. So I think those three things make it a really powerful test or approach for any provider who's trying to talk to a new patient or one they've had for a long time that might be stuck in whatever rut they might be from a health perspective.
Now, your test the acronym is FIT. It's food inflammation test. So everything's based on the idea. And I do love this. It's based on inflammation because that's my mantra. We want to manage and modulate inflammation. So now we know that food can be, or food that we're sensitive to, can be a potentiator for inflammation. Now, interestingly enough, some of the ideas, and it's really the backbone of food sensitivity, is the time from ingestion to the time that symptomology or inflammation is raised is up to 72 hours. So it's truly impossible for a patient to know that they're sensitive to a food, because how do I know what I ate 3 days ago is now cascading into inflammation in my body? Now, as a practitioner, I certainly don't know it, and it bodes the idea of testing and not guessing. So we all know that everybody should test for food sensitivities. More people should test for food sensitivities. How is your test different than the average run-of-the-mill test?
And I think there's some great tests out there and some even better companies running them. The limitation I always say is not those companies, it's the pathways that they're looking at. And so with this test, it's a multiple pathway approach on the basis. If it was just one marker, then that would be a fantastic thing. We could all measure it and we could all go home because we'd all feel good that we've kind of really nailed which foods may well be causing an inflammatory response. But what's been happening traditionally with food sensitivities is people were just looking at the IgG, which is the pathway which measures which foods you're exposed to. So very helpful to tell a patient, which food you're exposed to, but it doesn't go on to talk about that inflammatory pathway. And so the difference with the KBMO approach is rather than stopping at what you're exposed to, we go on and do a secondary screen to look at which of those foods are actually causing an inflammatory response. And so a good example of that is I did an IgG test one day and I did my multiple pathway approach on the same day. The single approach, just looking at what you're exposed to, I came up with 25 foods. When I just looked at the foods which are actually causing inflammation, that number was 5 on the KBMO test. So it's a great way of helping both the patient and the provider really zero in on the key foods of interest. And it was best described by a provider actually of mine in Ohio who said, James, what I love about the KBMO test is you're looking at the whole immune system versus half of the immune system. And so what she was, I think, really expressing there was just telling a patient what they're exposed to is not that helpful because there's all these, in the lingo they were described as false positives. So what we do is we eliminate those false positives and zero in on the foods which are causing inflammation, back to that key point that you made earlier.
Outstanding. So you're talking about testing or dual technology, which is your breakthrough. That's why I'm wearing your fleece. I mean, let's be real. I use it in my office. Full disclosure. Let's be transparent as we can. And that's because you're actually testing for antibodies. You're testing for IgG. But you're not just testing for IgG. You're testing for IgG 1 through 4, which enables you to test for a molecule, which is the most stable inflammatory molecule called C3D. Not trying to woo everybody with science, but the bottom line is, to really piggyback on what you said before about the immune system, IgG is an antibody, so that's part of your adaptive immune system. C3D is inflammatory, it's part of your innate immune system. So there's your dual technology, there's your dual pathway. It's creating an antibody, and that antibody is actually cascading inflammation. So that's why you call it a food inflammation test. Now, with all that being covered, what's the accuracy of the test? I get practitioners all the time. What's your accuracy? What's your sensitivity? What's your specificity? Again, how do you differentiate yourself from the good competition, as you said?
Yeah, exactly. So the way we do this is, again, we're measuring up to 176 different foods, colorings, and additives, and we'll talk about the importance of those colorings and additives later on in this chat. But we're measuring all these different foods, colorings, and additives. Traditionally, people have talked about sensitivity and specificity, and that approach works really well if you're looking at a single marker. Think cholesterol again, think glucose, which is a single marker, easy to put sensitivity and specificity data around that single data point. But with our test, it's a bit more nuanced and complex because you're looking at 176 different, say, cholesterols or glucoses, for example, on a single patient. And then if you add on top of that, we also look at the gut barrier panel, which we'll talk about. So really you're looking at 180 plus markers per patient. So the way we do it is we do it by a thing called the confidence interval, which is we work to the 95% confidence interval, which basically means for each one of those markers, we're 95% sure of the accuracy of that result, whether it be a positive result or a negative result. And so that's how we've approached this to make it much more user-friendly in terms of something that makes sense, rather than, we could do the sensitivity and specificity, but I think it would be somewhat meaningless and a great way of helping people sleep if you had that data on each of the 180 plus points. So our approach was, let's look at the confidence interval because that gives you a much more robust approach to the analysis and the answers that we give the patient and, more importantly, the provider through this testing.
Well, I'm happy you put that concept to bed because it's asked all the time when we're at conferences, accuracy and everything of that nature. So that was real clear and it's very salient. 176 foods, some of which you've got some of the newer foods in there. I think you've got hemp, you've got coconut oil, you've got good, it's escaping me right now. You've got the new protein.
Berry, goji berry, monk fruit, all sorts of
Right. Yours is the most up to date. Now, what I like most about your test, beyond the proverbial accuracy, is the fact that it's color coordinated. I have a split screen here, everybody, so I can see the colors. And the colors are great for the doc as a practitioner because it's easy for me to interpret. And then for me to elucidate it to my patients, the colors now make it even more apparent because red is a +4, meaning it's an elevation of inflammation. A +3 would be orange. The patients can see this. A +2 is yellow, and on and on and on. And obviously the colors have a specific meaning. So that's number one that I really like about the ease. Number two, I think you really made another valuable point about not just food, but you talked about coloring and additives and really emulsifiers. All these things lead to, as we segue into inflammation in the gut and increase the incidence of increased intestinal permeability, i.e. leaky gut. Not enough people are testing for those emulsifiers and those additives. They're overlooking it. And I think that that's, again, a game changer for you. Lastly, people always ask me about the foods. Are you testing organic? Are you testing raw? What's the state in which you're testing it?
Let me just before we go off from the colorings and additives, just to give people a better understanding of why we measure those areas and think about it in slightly a 3D world. So if you think about those colorings and additives, you find them in processed foods, and we're all guilty of eating processed food. So they're in there in terms of just trying to check for the labels as much as one possibly can on those. They're increasingly in supplementation. So again, it's not just what you're eating with your knife and fork. It's also things that, that you may be taking from a supplementation standpoint that may well have some of these colorings and additives in as well. And thirdly, you'll find them in personal hygiene products. So think shampoos, think creams, think washing powders. So, it always makes me think of an example where we had one provider tell me that, she had a 10-year-old boy who was very lethargic, and they did our food sensitivity test on him, and he came up for benzoic acid as a 4 plus. And when they looked at it, said, look, he's not consuming that. But then again, they remembered the concept that it's in there, it's in kind of personal hygiene products. It was in his mum's washing powder, and it was in the shampoo they were using for him. They removed it, and after 8 weeks, he was back to his normal self in terms of, as most of us kind of would appreciate a 10-year-old boy being a lot more energetic. So the reason I kind of give that example is twofold. A, it doesn't matter how organic you're trying to live these days, these colorings and additives of things are in the modern world. So it's just part and parcel of the way we live today. But secondly, some people say, James, well, I don't do testing because I think the elimination diet is the gold standard. I think I can confidently predict that there's no elimination diet that's going to say, well, why don't we start by eliminating benzoic acid? So I think the reality is the world's moved on from just looking at these elimination diets. There's some great tools out there now which are personalized and can individualize patient care. And as we all know, one size fits all is a pretty poor model. As I always give the example of the food pyramid. It's unfortunate that things haven't moved any further forward than the pyramids in terms of when we think of our food. So why don't we look at these things on an individualized basis? And as we said right up front, focus on inflammation, focus on individualizing this, but within a non-judgment zone, which gives a patient an ability to feel good about these results and take pride in how they can change their health trajectory in any which way they're looking to do based on this information as part of the jigsaw.
Fabulous, fabulous. A lot of personal testimonials in my office just removing the food sensitivities. And you and I talked about one just recently about a 16-year-old girl whose blood markers were up, and she hadn't taken any supplements, so no one can attribute to supplements, and everybody knows they use a lot of supplements. And in a 9-day period, we had to retest her. There was a glitch. And in that 9-day period, the dramatic change in her blood due to the removal of the inflammatory sources, i.e. the foods and the chemicals, was breathtaking. Now, of course, I wish at my age I would respond that way, and we're not purporting that 9 days is enough removal. It's usually 30, 60, and 90-day intervals. But when people remove foods that are inflammatory to them, I think you'll see this dramatic precipitous drop in inflammatory markers in blood tests. Now, the real question is, and a lot of people ask, how long do I have to remove the food? And can I put the food back in? And how soon? Because, God forbid we take anything from anybody here in America away, they immediately want to eat it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a natural thing. We're all very, very fortunate that we can access pretty much most types of food. So, and we generally eat what we like, and that's unfortunately not very varied anymore. So, as you say, the approach that we've always had is the best results. When I talk to the providers who use this test, and there's over 10,000 doing that now, they basically tell me that the best elimination period is about 3 months. The good news for everyone listening though as well is you can reintroduce these foods. So it's not like an allergy where thou shalt never eat this again. What we're saying is you can reintroduce these foods. So generally it's the elimination of about 3 months is the best time period that we've heard, and we've backed that up with some of the clinical studies that I'm sure we'll talk about later. And so when you look to reintroduce it, as Dr. Rob was saying, these foods can have an impact up to 72 hours. So have 1 or 2 servings of whichever food you've removed, wait that 72-hour period, make sure the symptoms that don't return. And then if they don't return, then move on to the next food. So generally, that's the approach that we've seen has worked and been most successful, listening to the providers that we had running the test now for decades, which is a great time period to kind of to work on in terms of the experience that they have and we have now as a company as well running these tests.
Are there any prerequisites to take the test? Meaning, if I think gluten is a problem for me, should I eat more of gluten if I've been gluten-free? Should I avoid gluten?
Yeah, I mean, that's another great question. I mean, generally, what we're trying to do is we're trying to test you for what you're currently consuming is leading to the symptoms that you present with when you go to any of the good providers like Dr. Rob, for example. So the idea is we're not suggesting you change your diet at all. And that advice, I think, is holds pretty solid for at least 95% of patients. There's a few patients who, to your point, Dr. Rob, may say, I've eliminated gluten or I've taken something out 12 months ago. I want to see whether I can reintroduce that. And I always give providers the two caveats to that. Firstly, make sure you've seen those test results to make sure it's not an IgE test that they did. Because again, what we're trying not to do is put them into the emergency room. The idea is if it was an IgG type test or a sensitivity type test, have 2 or 3 servings, a week or so before you run the test. And then, that'll give us a good way of working out, is that food part of the issue that you've had, or it's now safe to reintroduce that back in from a food sensitivity versus allergy perspective.
Right. In real brevity, in food sensitivity versus allergies, there are different IgGs and IgE-mediated responses of food allergy. It's like immediate swelling. Everybody's been on a plane where the flight attendants said no peanuts, for example, whereas IgG is a slow burn, if you will. And that's why there's usually that 72-hour delay or up to 72-hour delay in symptomology. You said it before, and I really want to piggyback because a lot of doctors listen to the podcast. Let's talk about clinical studies, because they're the difference makers. And you've got several clinical studies that you can delineate for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way of, as I remember, our technical founder is a guy called Dr. Brent Dorval, and he his not insignificant claim to fame was when he left MIT was he invented the first rapid HIV diagnostic. And so again, everything we do is percolated through that infectious disease lens to make sure that it's highly accurate as well as reproducible and up to that 95% confidence interval that Dr. Rob was talking about. But he said, when you do these studies, that's when the rubber hits the road, i.e. you can see, is there any differentiation between you and some of the other testing modalities out there? And so one of the most recent ones we did one with IBS patients, which again is a severe problem for many, many patients. And again, huge numbers in the US and worldwide suffer from it. So we thought, let's look at that, given, again, gut-related issues is certainly one of the symptomologies that we find a lot of our providers run this test on the back of. We tested 100 patients. It was an IRB-approved study under the guidance of a gentleman called Dr. William Esselfy, who's a gastroenterologist in California. And what we saw was a dramatic reduction in a thing called the IBS severity score, which is a reduction in the symptoms of the patients presenting. And then what we also did, which again, you might want to kind of consider as we talk on about some of the new tests we're adding, we also measured a thing called high sensitive CRP as well as homocysteine. And they are what you would say to any provider, not just a functional doctor, would understand as a true measure of inflammatory response. And both of those came down dramatically in the intervention group. So again, I think what we demonstrated with that study was, we saw symptoms improve and reduce dramatically. And on a personal level for the patient, that's dramatic, because what we saw is things like their number of trips to the kind of their primary care physician halved. So it went down by 50%. So again, that's not a reduction in your inflammatory markers. That's a real life example of how that benefits a patient who's having IBS is a really tough one to be living with. So again, think about how many hours in the day we're giving back to these patients who are dramatically reducing the number of trips they have to make to the surgery. So again, we saw inflammation go down, as I would argue is general inflammatory markers or even cardiovascular markers. And then we saw this dramatic improvement in the symptomology as well, in an IRB approved study. So that was great, which means, it's a review board approves this study. And again, we were really excited by the results that came out from that. So again, when you look at the literature, what was fascinating for me is we saw a dramatic improvement on the cell-mediated testing out there. When you look in the literature, they've done some IBS studies, and they saw half the reduction in the IBS severity that we did. And then when you compare it again in the literature with just the standard IgG test, we saw a 50% improvement on the symptomology than compared with the IgG as well. So again, not like for like in terms of patients, but when you look at that area of symptoms, we saw a dramatic improvement over the mediated cell, the lymphocyte type testing, as well as the only single pathway approach that we have. And again, it's worth mentioning, we are the only patented food sensitivity test on the market. And so again, that multiple pathway approach has been patented and gives us this ability to, as I say, eliminate those false positives and zero in on the key foods. And the reason why that's so important is compliance is so important for every patient. So for the providers, it doesn't really, if patients don't get on board with understanding these test results and working them through, then again, you won't get compliance. And so as Dr. Rob was saying, it's a color-coded 3-page report. As I mentioned, Dr. Dorval is a very smart individual, so he could, I'm sure, as Dr. Rob likes to say, elucidate for many hours on the benefits of complement activation. But again, the idea was, how do we come up with a report that's easy to use and read for not only the provider, who's very busy, but also the patient. So when they take that report away, they've got something they can look at and really understand. And again, that's why we color-coded it versus kind of blinding people with numbers. And I'll give a great example, and I'm a case in point. My triglycerides, which I'm slightly embarrassed to say, were above 400 post a Christmas, just after I'd bought this company. And so I went to my primary care physician. He said, well, I'm going to give you a drug for that because, there's no way you can bring that down. I ran the FIT test at the same time. And when you look up triglycerides, it's basically an indicator of lifestyle and diet. And so I'm thinking, well, I've just bought into a food sensitivity company. I should practice what I preach. So that's what I did. So I made sure I followed the diet that came with my food sensitivity test. And in a 6-month period, I took my triglycerides from over 400 to under 100. And so again, that was from, the elimination of the foods, bringing down that inflammation by focusing on diet and lifestyle. And so again, my provider was shocked. She said, well, what have you done? And so when I explained that to her, I said, why wouldn't you offer this to more people? People just don't do this stuff. And I said, well, again, maybe not, but why don't you at least give them that option to see, do they want to take control of their own lifestyle? Do they want to make those positive changes in their life? And in my position, it was an easy thing to take out 5 foods from my diet. And so again, by doing that, led to some substantial gains in my health based on triglycerides, which is one of the key cardiovascular markers that providers look at.
Well, there's a lot to unbox there. So the results, just to reiterate, of the IBS study, one, you showed KBMO versus the competition, how the accuracy, if I could use that word, really led to clinical outcome. The IBS scores went down dramatically. Homocysteine, a stroke marker, and we'll talk a little bit more on the homocysteine in a bit, and the HSC reactive protein. A little backdrop to the HSC reactive protein, that's usually increased from visceral fat. So now you really can use some of these markers to cascade into other markers. There was a test that you did also with the FIST, clinical testing results, where you had people do a symptomology exam, and it was fascinating to me because I would have thought, okay, food sensitivity test damages the gut, and will definitely stay away to, the gut barrier panel would be gas and bloating and brain fog, which was number 2 in symptomology. But the number one complaint that was reduced from the removal of food, everybody, was memory, concentration, anxiety, mood, and depression, i.e., we can say it now, mental health. Do you want to give us a little backdrop to that?
Yeah, it's fascinating. We did that study about 10 years ago now. And I think at the time we were slightly nervous that, people would doubt the validity of that statement that, hang on, how does gut health relate to brain health? And I think, Fast forward 10 years, that statement is now more of a commonplace thing to make, and people are very comfortable with that statement in many different walks of medicine. And what's really I found fascinating is we've almost gone from gut health going to brain health. We've now got a number of leading neurologists running the tests in their offices. So it's really been that flip, as it were, from actually brain health now down to gut health. And I think that's the great thing with this testing now, is that, it kind of segues us into the kind of the gut barrier and the gut health. And the reason why we kind of integrated that is because the food test looks at inflammation, and we've kind of covered some of the areas that are linked with inflammation. But the gut health is all around your immune health. And I think that's the great thing now. We're beginning to package these things together, where you're looking at inflammation, but you're also looking at your gut health and the importance of gut health. And I'm sure Dr. Rob can kind of give us some great stats on the importance of the gut. But it's really fascinating to me that in this 10, 15-year period, we've seen it really be something that's a lot more, patients are a lot more aware. People talk about, if we'd said microbiome 10 years ago, everyone would have said micro what? Now I think that's part of, the common vernacular here in the US.
Yeah, indeed. The gut is the epicenter of your health. To piggyback on what you said, 80% of your immune cells are in your gut. It's where your macro and macronutrients are absorbed. Even from a supplemental perspective or a digestive perspective, if there's damage to the gut, you're not going to digest. And as you said, there's a gut to brain axis, which I like to refer to as the superhighway to health. But really what you were saying is there's a gut to everywhere axis, gut to lung, gut to liver, gut to musculoskeletal, gut to kidney. Look, you're dealing with neurologists now. So the gut is without question the bullseye. So that said, I was searching for a gut barrier panel and you supplied it for me. So tell me what went into that and what you came out with and where we are right now on that test.
I mean, and let me just go back to the kind of the genesis of that test. So again, KBMO has been around for 14, 15 years now. And again, as every small company and whoever's founded a business, this will resonate with them. Frankly, if you're running a business, your first role in life is making payroll. Second is doing every other task that under the sun known to man. So one of those tasks, I was head of sales as well. It's a grand title for a 3-man company. But anyway, what I was doing was I was out in the field, kind of talking about the testing up in New Hampshire, it happened to be. And so what I was hearing from the providers up there, they really loved the fact that it was patented. They loved the fact it was this multiple pathway to eliminate the false positives. And they loved the fact that we were getting some really outstanding clinical outcomes based on this test and the removal of foods. But what I was hearing as well from some people was, look, they were saying, we love this test, James, but we don't always test for food sensitivities because we think our patients have leaky gut. And so that kind of resonated with me. And then, fast forward probably 8-9 years. And when I bump into Dr. Rob, who starts talking about guessing, testing, not guessing, it made me think, look, in their defense, there wasn't a really good gut barrier panel back in the day that they could have looked at to say, let's look at food sensitivities. And at the same time, let's see what might be going on from a gut barrier perspective as well. So again, maybe we're a bit slow on the uptake, but we developed this panel over a number of years to kind of make sure that we had something that would be clinically robust, to make sure that providers didn't have to guess. They could basically look at food sensitivities and leaky gut all at the same time with one test. And again, I know some labs have kind of tried to break these things out into multiple different panels and whatever they want to call it. Our approach is, let's be inclusive, let's put them all together, let's make it available for not only the provider, but more importantly, the patient, so that they've got as much information that we can give the provider to help treat that patient as humanly possible. And so that's why we took the view, let's have the food sensitivity, but let's include the gut barrier panel to make sure we give the provider a way of working out, does the patient have leaky gut? Or more importantly, if they don't, then that's great to know as well. And we can treat the inflammation on an individualized basis based on the food sensitivity test they've run. Or if there's gut issues going on. Let's treat that, and then kind of circle back to the inflammation at the same time. So again, what I think we've done is we've given a much more nuanced view than just a single pathway. It's a multiple pathway food sensitivity test, but now giving a provider a good entree into what might be going on from an immune health standpoint, and as well as a leaky gut perspective for their patient population as well.
Here, here. You know, when you talk about a gut barrier panel, I mean, that really speaks volumes to your idea of testing for inflammation, because the first time the outside world meets the inside world is something that gets through the gut, or i.e. digested through the small intestine. So the gut barrier panel, as you said, is testing for antibodies, IgA, which is a unique marker in this test versus the food sensitivities, IgG and C3D. So you're testing for candida, which is yeast. 97% of people who have fungal overgrowth have a candida overgrowth, or if you will, SIFO, small intestinal fungal overgrowth. So you're testing for candida. Candida mimics a lot of dysbiosis. They're sort of interrelated with each other. Your taste really initially was based on zonulin. Dr. Alessio Fasano, he has said all disease begins in the leaky gut. It took him 2,500 years for somebody to coin what Hippocrates said, all disease begins in the gut. It all begins in the leaky gut. And zonulin is a protein enzyme that depicts the stretching of tight junctions. You're also testing for occludin, which is the structural damage in a tight junction. So we're put together, interestingly, by epithelial cell, there's our tight junction, and it's kind of like a fence built around our intestinal tract. Zonulin pulls apart on the gate or the fence, and occludin is the break in the fence. Now you've added something called LPS, and you know, I have a running joke, and I know I've shared it with you. LPS, its nickname is El Diablo. LPS is a major outer surface membrane components present in almost all gram-negative bacteria. So when LPS is shown to be positive outside the gut, two distinct things happen. One, shows that gram-negative bacteria is floating around, and many of these bacteria are pathogenic. Number two, LPS is an endotoxin, which creates a tremendous amount of inflammatory markers, i.e. cytokines. More so than that, LPS can stimulate, as we cascade from this to the next test that you've added, can stimulate the increased incidence of heart disease. So it's been shown that the expression of LPS increases the incidence of heart attack by 3 times. Again, the gut to where? The gut to everywhere. And this really speaks volumes, because as a practitioner, when you really want to have the most invasive kind of look from a blood test, you're now able to look at food sensitivities, you're able to look at the gut barrier panel, put it together, and you can match with your standard type of other inflammatory markers. So I think this has been a great 1-2 punch. You know, it's a classic left jab, right cross, if you will. So in that, before we get to the CIT, let's wrap up the fit test, why providers use it, and if you could just reiterate one more time on that dual pathway, and of course add any color commentary that I may have missed in the gut barrier panel. I try to be concise.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we hear kind of routinely now from providers is some of those compliance tools as well. So for each test that comes back, we provide an individualized meal plan. So when the patient gets the test result, traditionally the first response was, "Oh my gosh, doc, what can I eat?" Good news is we provide a meal plan to give them some direction and for them to take control of their own health journey by moving forward with that. The other thing that we've done, again, we've put it on their phone. So we developed a phone app which gives them a way of seeing not only their meal plan that we just talked about, their full test results are on there, and each of the foods that they're sensitive to, we show them what that might cross-react with, where they might find it, and alternatives and substitutes. So we're giving them a little bit more information, but just about the foods they're sensitive to. We're not trying to overburden them with too much information, but just enough to kind of make that helpful. And again, the days of people coming home from seeing the doctor, pinning the results onto the magnetic fridge are gone, on the basis no one prints anything out for you anymore to doctors. And secondly, the other bad news is that your fridge isn't magnetic either, if you hadn't worked that out either. So the good news is we've moved with the times to say, let's put it on your phone. So if you are grocery shopping, you've got it with you. If you're out for dinner, you've got it with you. And again, for a lot of the providers who are listening, what we found is, I know marketing is one of your most favorite things to do. We found that the app itself has been a great marketing tool, because patients, and I hear this over and over again, one member of the family gets this test done, and before you know it, the rest of them are trooping in after them, getting the test done as well, because they're so interested in the information and the improvement generally in that first kind of the leader in the family, whether that's mum, dad, or whoever it might be, that it's one of those things that lots of family members like to do. So it helps, kind of really tighten that bond between patient and provider, in terms of by patients feeling confident and really proud of the results that they're seeing based off the elimination of these foods, and now also the gut barrier panel. The last thing which I'm going to add as well, we've also, with the gut barrier panel, a lot of these results can be quite complex. We've made it, again, simple. It's a positive or a negative. And what we put, and it's written down in black and white on our report, is if any of these 8 markers are elevated, you need to refer to your provider for a good gut healing protocol. And so what we've done there is we've partnered with some of the leading professional supplement companies on the market. So the likes of Biotics, Nutridyne, Designs for Health, Microbiome Labs have all developed a number of protocols that then work for the provider to then work with their patient population. So, and again, lastly on that, we've also now partnered with FullScript, so those are now available on FullScript as well. So the idea is, what our kind of really raison d'etre is, let's be a really good science-backed company based with really good clinical outcomes, but then let's make it easy for the provider and the patient to be able to be compliant with these test results. We're not trying to show that, Dr. Dorval's the smartest man in the room. He absolutely is, by the way. But the reality is, we want to make these accessible for everyone, the patient and the busy provider, to make sure that they can follow through and get good clinical outcomes based on the test results, and making those very approachable and readable for everyone to see.
I love the fact that I have my phone right here, that it's on the phone. So as a practitioner, we want to limit the amount of questions. And of course, we want to limit the amount of people who are not able to comply, because compliance is key. Once you get a good test and you get a good plan, the practitioners that are out there are all very astute. Things should work well. It's the lack of compliance or understandability. This makes it easy. I mean, I've had patients walk in and they say, hey, okay, these are the foods. This is my meal plan. I'm ready to go. That's number one. Number two, the protocols are great because everybody loves a protocol. So some practitioners need it. Sometimes the patients need it. So that compendium of things that you can pull from really is outstanding. However, I want to turn the page to get to the next chapter. Let me give you a couple of factoids. Heart disease is the leading cause of death for both men and women. This is the case in the US and worldwide. Early detection of biochemical markers allows early intervention and ability to prevent diseases. Most people don't get tested until disease is already causing a problem. So that being said, the number one cause of death is heart disease. And obviously that's based on inflammation. What did KBMO do to counter that?
So we came out with the cardiovascular inflammation test because, again, to your point, you mentioned it with the LPS is a contributor to heart disease. As I mentioned with the IBS study we did, we looked at high sensitive CRP, we looked at the homocysteine levels. So again, there's a massive crossover with these markers that we were looking at, and we're looking at inflammation, root cause of all these things as well. So our approach was, how do we try and improve patient care? All these tests are finger sticks, so they're really easy for providers to do. They don't have to always wait for the phlebotomist to be in town or in the office. We can drop ship all these kits directly to patients' homes. So the idea is, can we make sure we make all these things accessible? So we came up with the cardiovascular inflammation test, and we added a number of markers which we considered to be essential. But let me give you some of the numbers which will frighten you. Again, in a slightly worrying way, we added a thing called ApoB, which is the number one indicator of cholesterol. And so again, if you go around the rest of the world, it is the standard of care. Here in the US, only 5% of the population have been tested for it. So again, it's remarkable to me that, again, we're really, really advanced in so many ways here, but we're not necessarily, as Dr. Rob was talking about, doing some of these early tests to make sure we can get ahead of some of these disease states for the patient population that a lot of you serve. The other one, which again is a staggering number for me, was LP little a, which again is a great indicator of the aggressiveness of the plaque in your arteries. So again, the plaque is the thing that leads to stents, it leads to heart attacks and things like that. So again, LP little a is a genetic marker, and so again, in this age of everyone talking about DNA and all these things, most of the disease states that we're being persuaded to be tested for are maybe 5% of the population, 10% maximum. LP little a impacts 30% of the US population. So 1 in 3 of you listening here will probably have elevated LP little a. So again, it is a no-brainer for a provider to add this into the number of cardiovascular tests they're doing versus the standard lipid panel. So the idea here is let's give some of these tests out there. And again, it was Dr. Rob that told me this next factoid here. 1% of the US population have been tested for LP little a. So again, we're trying to add some of these markers to make sure that we can improve the standard of care. But back to what we talked about originally, the food inflammation test. If we can help identify which are the causes of inflammation, we can help reduce inflammation, the root cause of most of these disease states. As Dr. Rob quite greatly pointed out there, the number one killer in the US is cardiovascular disease. So we wanted to add this third leg of the stool, as it were, to say we're looking at inflammation via your diet with the FIT test. We're also now looking at your gut health in terms of with the gut barrier panel. And now with the CIT test, it gives you a way of helping treat your patient for some of the key cardiovascular markers, which we consider to be really important. So rather than necessarily, here's 60 markers and most patients kind of go, oh my gosh, don't understand what any of these things mean. We stuck it to 10, keep it simple and make it so you can have a really good discussion with your patients about the importance of some of these markers. And given those numbers of 1% of the population and 5% of the population, it gives you a way of hopefully improving their patient care pretty dramatically by also now adding the CIT test to your armory of things that you may want to check for when you have a new patient or an existing patient coming through the door.
So you're basically step laddering up. You're doing the food inflammation, then you're taking the next step to the gut barrier. Now remember, a gut barrier test, everybody, not to muddy the waters, is also, for me, a blood-brain barrier test, because whatever you do to your gut, you do to your brain. Whatever you do to your brain, you do to your gut in a millisecond. And now we've taken into everyday usage where people go once, maybe twice a year to their medical doctor to get standardized tests, but they're really not getting the type of tests that they should. They're sort of looking at the river and just looking at the top. And the CIT test is digging into the water and getting to the bottom without scrunching up the bottom. The ApoB is really important in that, as you said, it is the single best cholesterol predictor for risk of heart disease and stroke. Every dangerous particle of cholesterol is wrapped around this, and virtually nobody tests for it. LPS is that genetic marker, but here's the interesting thing about, LP little a is that genetic marker. As you said, less than 1% of the population is tested for it. You have to have your relatives tested for it. But more so than that, the standard for any kind of aberrant cholesterol marker is statins. Statins actually raise LP little a. So that's one of the reasons you may not hear it as much in the news or the data. And you also have got hemoglobin A1C, which is really your diabetic and your pre-diabetic marker. I think over 96 million Americans are pre-diabetic. So it's 100 million Americans, 1 in 3 are pre-diabetic. 50% of Americans are obese and overweight. So the hemoglobin A1C measures your average blood glucose over a 90 to 120 day period with an emphasis on the last 30 days. And you're also testing your high specific C-reactive protein. So if I have a patient that walks in, I do a food sensitivity test. I decrease that. I also talk about changes in diet and maybe fix their gut barrier to put it in a pristine condition. Life is good. So for me, the advantages of your CIT test. It's a dry blood spot. And I think that was something that you mentioned, but maybe we need to go into more detail. You can get a serum where they remove it and put it in a vial, or you can dry blood test it, which works really well for people who need to do a test at home, and it goes with any kind of virtual type of nutrition practice. You're also validated against serum testing. There's a 96% plus agreement. You've shown it to be stable for 14 days. And once again, it gives patients another major screening tool to assess overall health and, for me, longevity. So you're testing immune health with the gut barrier panel, you're testing inflammation with the food sensitivity test, and you're testing cardiovascular health with the CIT test, all leading towards health and longevity. So this is a staple in everybody's office. When I say everybody's office, every doctor's type of office. I use this in all my patients. My credo is, as I said before, to manage and modulate inflammation. How am I supposed to know what the source of inflammation is unless I test for it? So, James, what's next? What do you got in a hopper?
What's next? It's a great comment. I think we're looking at a number of elements, maybe adding further markers to the gut barrier panel. And then I think, as we roll these tests out to see, how it works there. And so, again, without giving too many secrets away, I think, middle of the year, we've got another big area that we're working on in terms of, again, around the food sensitivity testing, in terms of a slightly different segment. So, again, as we roll that out, we'll be excited to come on and tell everyone about it. And I'm sure... to give a slight clue, when all your kids disappear off to college, you're left generally with something that wags its tail. So what we might want to do is look after the person that's wagging his tail to make sure that they don't have any food sensitivity or any issues around that as well. So again, we're in the process of doing a number of studies in that market right now, and so the results are looking really encouraging. So again, that's one of the areas we're going to look at as well as I say, further development of the gut barrier panel and rolling this out not only here in the US but internationally. In terms of as well, we're getting a great response because again, with that finger stick technology, it's really robust. The fit test is stable for 30 days, the CIT 14 days, and again, the testing. Just to give an idea of how robust this is. We just had some data back from a lab that we partnered with in China. They ran 75 patients, all comers, all different symptomology, kind of brain health, gut health, skin-related issues, headaches, things like that. So kind of all comers. And of those 75, they put them all on a 3-month elimination diet, and they saw an 82% improvement in that patient population. So again, the test works really well to reduce inflammation. All those symptoms are, the root cause of them is inflammation. And so, but for me, I think the nice thing about that study was we provided the components for them to run the test. They chose all comers. So again, give us your best shot in terms of any patient coming through the door, which is real life versus saying we're only going to look at a segment of the population. And again, we didn't run the test. It was run in a third-party lab. So I think, a lot of, when you look at some of these studies, you need to make sure that, is it truly an independent study? Or was it done by the company? And so here's a great example of a truly independent study. And again, shows the robustness of this testing in a different population versus just the standard US one that we use typically, with many different symptoms as well. So we're really pleased with that quality of data. And I would argue that would be further enhanced if they were to introduce the use of supplementation as well. And so that belt and braces approach of the testing plus supplementation, I know, Dr. Rob, you've had great success when you combine the two.
Without question, if I know where it is, to the concept that you talked about before, root cause resolution, when I know what the root cause is, I can supplement more effectively. Otherwise, I'm sort of aiming in the dark with a blindfold on. And I know practitioners alike really laud your test because the ability to be accurate and get that clinical outcome that we so desire. So, ladies and gentlemen, I got this gentleman on for a period of time. He dropped all these clinical gems, these knowledge bombs. This is James White. He is the CEO of KBMO Diagnostics. If you have any issues, it's kbmodiagnostics.com. Am I correct?
Correct.
And everybody, you guys can reach out, ask any questions. We have to do a part 2 because it sounds like, as you will, you have a lot in the hopper. I look forward to it, and thanks for your time today.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. And thanks everyone for listening. Much appreciated.
My pleasure. Enjoy. See everybody soon. Dr. Rob, always yours in health.